Hello and welcome to the second video in the Power BI Tales from the Front series, where we do walkthroughs of solutions from the Power BI community or other places. This series is intended for folks that are already Power BI users and may want to pick up some tips or just see how to approach more advanced topics. Um, my name is Pat Mahoney. I started Hoosier BI just as a hobby, and I provide free Power Platform training for Indianapolis nonprofits. If you like these videos, and I have a bunch more planned if they're well received, so please go ahead and subscribe to this channel or follow me on Twitter. If you're not already active on the Power BI community, I definitely encourage you to do that. It's a great place to get help if you need it, to help others, and in the meantime, pick up other tips from other solvers or just keep your skills sharp. Today's topic is a DAX topic, and I was on the fence whether it should be intermediate or advanced, so I just called it advanced. And what we're going to walk through is a solution to a user that needed to count the consecutive days that some amount was zero at the same location. So let's jump over to the scenario and see exactly what we're talking about. And basically, there's some value, this amount column that's tracked by date and location, and sometimes it's zero. And this user wanted a calculated column to count the number of consecutive days that the amount was zero for that location. And just to see what we're talking about there, I'll go ahead and sort this by location so it makes it a little more obvious. But basically, hey, okay, today for location A, that's a 0, so that should be a start of a 1 count. We have a non-zero number here, so it goes back to a 0, and then we have 3 days in a row that are all 0, so this one should be 1, 2, and 3. And I'll go ahead and just add the column here that does this, just so you can see what the desired results were. I initially, the one I'll go through today isn't actually the one that I posted on the community. I had an earlier version of it that looked good and actually met the person's needs and was accepted as a solution. And when I was putting this video together, I realized there was one use case one scenario where it didn't work. You see the difference here, this 2 and 1. So if you want to look at this file, that column and its associated measure, I have measure versions of these columns as well. You can check that out as well, but it actually didn't work in one scenario. So I'm just going to walk through, for the sake of time, walk through this one that gives the correct things. So one good tip before you start writing DAX expressions is to just think it through in English. What's the logic that I need here? And so there's at least 2 ways to approach this, and these 2 are covered in those 2 columns I just described. The first one is actually this one that didn't meet all the scenarios, and so the one I'm going to talk about today is the second one. But in both of these, there's this easy part here where basically check out what the amount is on this day for this location. If it's not 0, just go ahead and put a 0, because that's obviously not going to be a consecutive day of 0. So that's the easy part, and that applies to both. The 2 other approaches here would be, and this is something I recommend sometimes, is to consider the opposite condition. That the first way I approached this was actually to look for the last date that wasn't 0, and then count the number of days between those 2, and that would tell you how many days of 0 you had in between those. And this actually worked pretty well, and it's the solution I posted. But again, it didn't work in one scenario here, where this location D, the first only had 0 numbers for amount and didn't have any non-zero ones, and so it actually didn't meet the condition there, meet the requirement. So the one we're going to talk about is to basically say, hey, all right, for whatever date I'm on for this location, go and find the minimum date where all the rows in between are zeros, okay? And then count the number of days between that minimum date and the date that I'm on, and that'll tell me my consecutive days of 0, right? So hopefully that should make sense. So let's jump over, since the request here was for a calculated column, we'll jump over to data view here, okay? And here we have our columns again. I already have it sorted by location. And so one thing we'll think about as we're going through this is let's pick this May 5th date for location A, where we've gotten, 3 days in a row of 0, and it's not sorted by, let me sort by date first. Okay, well, in any case, we have 3 days in a row that are 0, and so it's this row that we're focused on here. So let's go ahead and pull up the expression that worked. I called this one as correct at the end. And it's a long expression, and what I'm trying to do in this series is to put lots of comments throughout, and comments are added to your DAX expressions with a double slash or a double dash, and then it'll show up in green here in your expression. And of course, you should format your expressions. I format all mine on going to daxformatter.com. And so I'm just going to jump to the end of this first and show you that easy part I described. And so in this case, it's starting out this if condition. So basically this expression has a bunch of variables. Some are values, some are tables, and we'll go through those in a minute. But then the return here is, hey, check out the value on whatever row I'm on, go over to the amount column. If it's not a 0, go ahead and return 0. All right, so that one's real easy because if it's a non-zero, then our count of 0 days is resetting. And then the opposite condition is, okay, if it is a 0, then go ahead and calculate the difference in days between this variable called min0 that we'll talk about and get to, and this date, which turns out the date that's on this row of the column. And then add 1 to that, because, for example, if yesterday was 0 and today was 0, that would actually be 2, but the difference in days would be 1, so we need to add 1 to our result to get a value of 2 if yesterday and today were 0. All right, so let's go back to the top of this expression. And so the first thing I do here is store a couple things in variables. And so the syntax is you start with var, name the variable, and set it equal to some expression. Because this is a calculated column, we have row context. And so all we have to do is reference the column and it'll grab the value. We don't need to do an aggregation like we would have to do if this was a measure, for example. So we can just say, okay, whatever row I'm on, go over and grab the date, and whatever row this is, go over and grab the location. So then I'm storing those, and so now I can use these values multiple times throughout this expression if I need to. All right, so I said what I wanted to do was to make a table of all the 0 rows, and basically I want to count the minimum date where all the rows in between are 0. So what I need to do is generate a virtual table of all the 0 rows that are less than this date, because this is a consecutive calculation, and I need to keep it the same location. So I'm going to use these two variables. So what I'm going to do here is, if you look inside at this filter, I'm going to filter the data table. So this is referencing this table, which is the table that we're on. And because we're referencing the whole table, it's not going to have any filter context on it, so it's going to be the whole table. So we need to filter it down. So what we're going to do is filter it down to these conditions where the date is less than this date variable, where it's this location, and where the amount is 0. So again, I want to make a virtual table of the dates less than this date for this location that are equal to 0. And so this expression does that. And then what I'm going to do is use the summarize function, the first term of which is a table, which is what this filter expression returns. And then I just want to summarize the date. So coming out of this, so what this variable is going to be is just the dates that meet all these conditions, a distinct list of those dates. All right. So the second thing I'm going to do is I want to add some columns to that virtual table. So I have my one column table of dates that meet these conditions, and I'm going to add 2 things, right? So for me to calculate, I want to find the minimum date where all the rows in between are 0, right? To do that assessment, I need to know 2 things. I need to know how many days come in are between that minimum date and the date that I'm starting with, the one in the this date variable, and then count the number of 0 rows in between those two. And if those numbers are the same, then I know that all the dates in between those two endpoints are 0 and therefore should count towards my consecutive 0. So these two columns calculate those two things. All right. And so that's very commonly done with the add columns expression. So you do add columns, you put a table there. Variables can be tables, so I'm going to just reference this 0 rows table, which is the one we just talked through. And then I'm going to give it a name for this new column. I'm just calling it delta. And again, I'm going to make a variable inside of this expression now. And I'm just going to say, hey, I want to store the date on this row. So this is going to be for every column in this virtual table. I want to do a calculation on that row and add a column to it. So similar to before, I'm using the row context inside this virtual table to just store that date value in a variable. And then I'm going to go ahead and just do that simple calculation where I'm going to say, okay, for the row that I'm on, what's the number of days between this row and the original date in my calculation in days, right, in units of days. All right, so that's the delta column. For the rows column, it's a little trickier, but again, I'm going to store this date in a variable. It turns out that variable we defined above is not available in this expression, so we just simply make another one. So I called it date this row 2, and again, use the row context to grab the date. And then in this case, I want to count the number of 0 rows in between it. And so since our table that we started with is all zeros in between, this virtual table we created in this 0 rows table, all we have to do is count the number of rows that are greater than the row that I'm on, and that'll tell me the number of rows in between. Okay, and so to do that, I can just say, okay, filter this virtual table that we created above for just the dates that are greater than this date. And since they're all zeros, that's going to give us the number of rows that are 0 between these two dates, the date that I'm iterating over and the original date for the row of our calculation. All right, and so one tip you can do that I recommend is as you're writing more advanced expressions, you can sort of check your work and see how you're doing. And so one thing you can do is to actually make a temp table, a DAX calculated table, just to make sure everything's working correctly. So before I do that, I want to minimize this and just we'll pick that example. So in this case, let's focus on the May 5th date for location A, where we've had 3 zeros in a row, and we expect to get a value of 3. Okay, so what we can do is use that expression, right? We said variables can hold tables, so what we can do in a DAX calculated table expression, I can hit new table, and then I can paste my expression in, and I'm actually able to return a table instead of a scalar value that would typically go in a visual. So before I showed you, we made this variable called with columns where we added the delta and rows columns. So I can actually just return this here, ignore this part. I can return this with columns, and I'll actually get the virtual table that I've been working towards. Well, since that has some things where it's looking for, the location and the date for the row that it's working over, I can actually hard code those values in as follows. And so what I did to troubleshoot is I hard coded and used the date formula to hard code in May 5th, and I hard coded in the location of A, and then everything else is the same except that I just returned this virtual table to make sure, and I want to see that my delta and rows calculations are working correctly. And so it appears that it is, right? So again, we're on May 5th for location A, and what it does is it filters, it initially creates a table, a 1-column table of dates that are less than this date and are 0. And you notice the May 2nd date is missing because that had a non-zero result. And then we add 2 columns to it. One is the number of days between this date and the date that I'm on, the row that I'm on in that virtual table, and then also to count the number of rows that are greater than this date. So in this case, there's one date greater than it, so we get a 1. Same thing here. This is 2 days from here, and there's 2 rows greater than it. But if we go to this one, we actually have 4 days between May 1st and May 5th, but our virtual table of 0 values only has 3 rows greater than it, so our condition isn't met. So in this case, our minimum date that meets the condition where the days between equals the number of 0 rows is this one here, May 3rd. And so our count of consecutive days of 0 should be 1, 2, 3. We get our result. And so how that's calculated is to take the difference of the 2 and then add 1, as we talked about before. So if I go back to that expression, the last step of it is, so now we've created that virtual table, but it's again using the location and date values from whatever row that it's measuring on, and now we can finally calculate our min 0 variable. And so this one we're going to use a min x formula. Again, we want the earliest date where the delta and the rows have the same value. And so what we can do is the first expression of a min x or an x iterator function is a table. So we'll give it a table. And so we'll use filter again, where we'll filter our virtual table to just the rows where these two values are equal. And then once you have that, iterate over that table and return the minimum value in the date column. All right. And so for that row we talked about, this would return that May 3rd value. And so for that particular one, we'd have May 3rd. The original, this date would be May 5th. That would then go into this part of the calculation we covered before, where we'd have May 3rd, May 5th. There would be 2 days in between those. We'd add 1 to it, and we'd get our result of 3. And so it would do this same calculation, make these virtual tables for every row in that table in that calculated column. Okay, so that's a long expression to get that result. And again, if you're interested, you'll be able to hit the link and download this file. Just to cover a few key points that I wanted to reinforce as we're finishing up this one. Again, store values that you're going to use multiple times in variables. It's also a great way to clarify your DAX expressions, make it easier to read for you and others. If you're building a complex calculation, use those DAX calculated tables to visualize a virtual filter, sometimes putting in hard-coded values to get it to cover one scenario so you can check that it gets the right answer. We didn't really go through the one that didn't work here, but that's the one that actually started with, instead of trying to look for rows that had 0, it actually started out easier to look for rows that didn't have 0 and then just measure the number of days between the last non-zero and this one. In this case, it didn't cover one scenario, so I ended up going with the approach we talked about today. But I frequently solve stuff by using the opposite condition, so it's just something to keep in mind. It may simplify the logic is to go with throw a not in there, or the opposite condition. As I mentioned here, they don't work in every scenario, so to check it out before you think you're done. This person asked for a calculated column. I usually recommend to do measures instead of columns if possible. It saves file size, but more importantly, you get a dynamic calculation that responds with slicers, etc. But sometimes you need columns if you're going to use it in along your axis or in a legend or something. Then you need a column. For example, if you were going to make a histogram of give me the count of days that had a certain number of consecutive zeros, then that would have to be a column. A measure wouldn't work for that, but most of the time you can write a measure instead of a column and get some of the benefits there. All right, so hopefully you found that interesting. Again, please subscribe to see future videos of these. Add comments if you have different ways you would have solved this. Get that discussion going. Thank you.